For the people who came late or weren't able to make it. So nobody's going to show on the recording. It's just going to be my slides and my face. So right now you're seeing me, and if I do this, you should be seeing me and the PowerPoint slide. Give me a thumbs up if that's what everybody's seeing.
Yep.
All right, so we're off to the races. That's good. So today is really talking about composition and composition considerations. So what is it? And I think that's a good place to start. I mean, we talk about all kinds of things in photography: sharpness, brightness, contrast, blah 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 blah. But composition is about the visual elements. It's how we place things in our screen. It's what we choose to include in our frame. Are we going to come in close? Are we going to stay far away? If you're looking at an image and you happen to see sort of a garbage pail next to the couple you're photographing, well, you're going to include the garbage pail, or you're just going to zoom in a little bit and avoid it. So it's a way to decide what you're going to look at. And it's a way to create a visual message for the viewer. So you want the viewer to be able to see what you see. What did you feel? What inspired you to take this photo? And if the viewer sees what you feel, what you saw, and feels what you felt, then you're getting closer to sending the right message. So it's not just a matter of just capturing whatever happened to be in front of your lens. You're choosing to be in front of your lens. And you're choosing to arrange things in a number of different ways. And we'll talk about all the various elements in which you can arrange things in order to follow various rules. And I hate the word rules, but there's various styles of composition. And knowing them and understanding them will help make your pictures a little bit stronger. So composition is really, helping somebody sort of see what you see, and the thing is, it's nothing to do with how sharp your picture is or how well exposed it is. You'll be using a cell phone or an iPhone. It really doesn't matter what kind of camera you have. It's really you're trying to get a concept across. And Ansel Adams once said, "There's nothing worse than a really sharp image of a fuzzy concept." So the question is, what are you taking a picture of? Why are you taking this picture, and conveying that somehow? So it's important to make your photograph more pleasing, more interesting, more impactful. It helps you capture a scene in a unique way that's you. I mean, how many of us have gone to a place that says, here is a scenic point, or a photographic point. You're driving along the highway and there's a little camera picture, and you pull your car off, and there's this, nice high point that lets you look at a beautiful vista. And how many thousands of people have stood at that same spot and went click? So what are you going to do that's different? Is there anything that you can do to make that picture a little bit more unique or whatever? And try to make that picture yours. So the bottom line here is the composition is really how the photo is perceived by others and how you can make it something that you want to see, you want to convey to other people. So one might ask, how do I know if it's a good composition? And it's a really, really tough question. There's no really definitive answers to what's good. I mean, you're an artist. You're trying to convey something. It's like saying, what's good art? I mean, people debate all kinds of artistic concepts over time, and there's contemporary art, and there's modern art, and there's this and there's that. So it's a question of your style, and then defining your style, defining your vision, defining your intention is part of coming up with a good composition. But so you decide whether it's good or not, and I think the best way to know that is are people looking at the photos and seeing what you saw? And if the answer is yes, then obviously the composition was good because you got across what you wanted
I
to
just
get
lost
across. Nope.
audio.
Nope. Is everybody lost audio?
We lost audio.
Cannot hear Mike.
Yeah, no audio.
Okay, let me just check here.
Can't hear you, Mike.
1 second here. 1 second. All right.
There
Is
you
that
go.
better? I'm not sure what happened there, but I will.
We can hear you loud and clear now.
All right.
Yeah,
So
fine.
how far back do I go?
About 3 sentences.
About 3 sentences. Okay, let's go back here.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start back here. So I was going to say the composition is there's no perfect answer to when a composition is good. It's really up to you as an artist to be able to convey what it is you want it to convey. So if everyone's looking at your photo and says, "Oh wow, look at that beautiful, I don't know, color toning," and you're going, "Oh, obviously color toning got the better of me," and my technique is what people are seeing and not the picture. Or someone comes along and looks at the photo and says, "Oh wow, like I really love the way that the rain's coming down." And you're going, "Oh, okay, the rain was incidental. I was trying to get across the concept of dreary and drab and whatever." So it's that kind of thing. So what you want to do is try to arrange things so that it fits your subject and reinforces your subject. The way in which you light your image or choose your exposure in terms of use of lights and darks will create contrast, it'll create mood, and so that conveys or projects something for your viewer. And the way in which you arrange things in terms of choosing your position, your angle, high angle, low angle, whatever, will make things look a little different. You're shooting up high and all of a sudden the sky is your background as opposed to a fence and a building and a whatever. So we'll talk about some of those types of things. And ultimately what you're trying to do is composition is one that communicates your message effectively and engages your viewer's attention. So think of it as, if someone was to look at your photograph, where's their eye going to travel through the image? And that's partly what we're going to talk about today is making sure that you can sort of put together an image and kind of almost predict how people are going to look at it. So there's all of these different techniques or rules or whatever, your crop factor, your orientation, rule of thirds, subject isolation, etc. We're going to step through each one of these one at a time and sort of go into them in a little bit more detail and see how you can use these to your advantage. So let's start with the very first one, sort of crop factor. So crop factor and orientation is really what you're choosing to include in your frame, and also keep in mind that at some point in time, if you're going to print this image or you're going to share it online, it may not be exactly the way it was in your viewfinder. And so you have to think ahead to, how am I going to use this photo? Where is it going to appear? And then, the next one is, am I going to hold my camera horizontally and make this a horizontal shot, or am I just going to turn my camera around and turn this into a vertical shot? Those are very simple questions that have to happen just before you even go click. So that's right off the bat how you're starting to create your composition is you're trying to decide horizontal or vertical. Am I going to include a lot in the frame or a little bit in the frame, and what am I going to put near the edges? So the crop factor is the fact that our cameras shoot essentially the old 35 millimeter format. So 24 by 36 was the format, or it's a 2 by 3 format if you think of it that way. So the picture on the right shows you a 2 by 3 format, and everything in that photo would be in the frame if you went from the top to the bottom. Same thing with the one on the left. Both of those, if you showed them full frame, would be very nice. If you turn around though and you crop these into an 8 by 10 format on the right, or you try to post this picture on Instagram, which is typically prefers a square format, you're going to end up losing part of the image. And it might be a vital part on the right. There's just a little bit of a dress missing and the top of his head missing. But I mean, it's something you have to think about. So when I'm shooting a wedding, for instance, I have to be careful to think that the composition has to be something that will fit an 8 by 10 frame, because that's usually where people put their wedding photos these days. Some people are putting their photos on digital tablets and that kind of stuff these days. So things are changing, but the question still is, how are you going to frame your image? I remember as a young pup, photographing something that was horizontal, and I was doing portraits, and I was doing all stuff that's vertical and as portrait shots. And then when I delivered the pictures, someone says, the reason I did this photo shoot is because I wanted to put my photo into a frame that my mother gave me for Christmas, and it was a horizontal frame. And I'm going, I wish you would have told me that when I did the photo shoot. But so all my pictures were portrait sized and portrait style and so on. So here's a nice little butterfly. It's nice and close, and one of the rules we'll talk about later is fill the frame. So if you fill the frame, that typically makes for a good photo. But you can actually leave a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of negative space, and sort of put a little bit of emphasis into the habitat and show a little bit more of the butterfly. You can go even further back and make sure the flower isn't floating, and the flower's now got a stem, and the picture has a base. But as my eye flows through this photograph, I see the butterfly, and then the beautiful bright stem all of a sudden leads my eye out of the photo, down and out. And I'm going, oh, that's maybe not what I want. Well, what if I reverse this? Oh, well, now my eye flows into the photograph, follows the stem, and lands on the butterfly. And so I have a lot of choices, and it's all the same photo, and it's all the same, butterfly. So you have choices when you're presenting your images, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So Mike, could you
Yeah.
just for 1 second explain why the inverted image leads the eye differently?
We'll talk a little bit about that later, but the quick answer is, in our culture, in North American culture, we tend to read left to right. And so our eye tends to travel through images almost that way. And so some people will look at this photo and they'll see the butterfly, and then they'll kind of explore the rest of the photo, and their eye will flow out of the image following the stem. Whereas this one, typically your eyes led into the picture. And this isn't a rule that is universal, and some people will disagree and prefer to do that. Some images just happen to look better one way or another. Explore it. See if it jives with you.
Thank you.
No problem. So, horizontal or vertical? Again, no hard and fast rules here, but typically something which is horizontal is restful, flowing, soothing, etc. Something which is vertical tends to be more emphasized, dramatic, vibrant. So the mood shifts a little bit depending on whether you take it one way or another. Pretty much the same image, not a whole lot of difference, just different cropping and so on. But if you start thinking in terms of what do I want to project, is this a powerful image or a high impact image, or is this supposed to be, soothing, restful type of mood, that might influence some of your decisions as you move along. So, I mean, these are very quick things that you can think of before you even do that shutter click. So the rule of thirds is probably the most well publicized, known, referenced rule. Essentially, its emphasis is to create balance and to give you a somewhat natural composition. Divides your frame into 9 equal parts, and then you place your subject at one of the intersections. So that's the rule of thirds. So if you look at a typical picture, such as the little bird, the eye of the bird is at one of those intersection points. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 intersection points. This image of this lady weaving in Peru, the face ends up landing in exactly one of those intersection points. So these, when you're cropping in Lightroom or many other tools, these guides will be given to you. And the reason the guides are there is because they're well-known rules for composition. You'll find your butterfly has another one of these types of things. I forget what this one's called, but it's another one of these intersection points. So they're kind of a rule of triangles as opposed to a rule of thirds. This is a very formal composition where something is right smack in the middle. And here's another form of sort of rule of thirds, but it's on a diagonal. So these are all different ways to position and center your objects. So let's just stay here for a moment. So the thing is, when you're taking the picture, I mean, are you going to do it pure bullseye and put everything right smack in the center, or are you going to move things a little bit over? I mean, when I took this picture, I could have in fact put her face right smack in the middle of the image, but I chose to move it to the side, and it does a couple of things. We'll see the rule of thirds is here is one of the factors. You'll see that the weave is on a diagonal, and we'll talk about diagonal lines later. There are some leading lines in terms of other things that bring your eye to the face. So there's a number of things that are pointing you all to her face, and these are the types of things that we'll be talking a little bit about. Subject isolation is another rule or consideration that you want to have. So it's where you use the camera's depth of field in order to focus on the subject, and your eye tends to go to the sharpest piece of the image. So that's the thing that you need to be aware of. Is one of the things that happens is your eyes move left to right, typically. One of the things that happens is your eyes will find the sharpest areas, typically, and we'll talk a little bit later, your eyes find the brightest area, typically. So these are the kinds of things that you become aware of, and then you use those to your advantage. So how do you create low depth of field? Well, you can use very wide apertures, you can use very long lenses, you can use macro lenses. These are all things that help draw your attention to the subject. So here the eyes pop out. There's a lot of other things happening in here. There's a lot of other things going on in this photo, but your tendency to just see the thing that's sharpest. Then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's very soft because it's reflecting off a windshield, and it's further behind her or further in front of her. So it tends to grab your attention. Same type of thing here. The stuff in the background is often, we talk about bokeh and things like that are far behind the subject, but you can have things in the foreground as well that tend to frame your subject and be out of focus, and because they're out of focus, they don't tend to take away too much attention from your subject, but they tend to frame your subject as well. And framing is yet another technique. So as we go through these things and you start building on rule of thirds and isolating your subject and so on and so forth, you can in fact find that some of these things reinforce one another and build on one another. So there isn't a rule of thirds type of thing happening here. This was meant to be more of a symmetrical type of composition. So you use just the technique here is more of the isolation one. Okay, so the eye is really, really sharp, and the depth of field is so light that even her earring starts to get a little soft, and the stuff behind her is soft. And again, there's a little bit of something in the foreground giving it a bit of sense of mystery, but it's not taking necessarily too much away from the face, and it really depends on the intent of the image as well. If the focus is on the eyes, then you've taken away some of the attention from her lips and the rest of her face. So the eye then becomes the dominant focus. So it really depends on what it is you're trying to project as we go along. I just pause every now and then, make sure that I'm still have everybody with me. So a frame within a frame is another technique. It's where you start creating interest by creating layers, and your subject is really found within another subject. So there's a lot of different ways of doing that, and you can get frames that are natural, like the trees we just had a moment ago. They could be artificial. It might be a doorway or something like that. It might be a window. It might even be a mirror. So, something like this. A horse is sticking its head out the stall door, and it just tends to create this kind of a frame around the animal and gives it a different look than if the animal was just floating in midair and just out in the middle of an arena or something along those lines. Here the frame is the mirror, where a lot of the background is gone into darkness. The light is really hitting her face, and that face is being reflected in a mirror, and there's just enough other light in the picture to add some matter of interest. If I focused in really, really close and I just zoomed in on the mirror, I don't think the picture would have the same impact as you turn around and you can see sort of the rest of her, so you can have some context in terms of what is this a reflection of. And you'll also see another technique a little later on. We'll talk about telling a story. So she's doing something. She's not just static. She's not just posing. You can sort of get a sense that she's about to step out, or maybe going somewhere, or something along those lines. So these are all sort of different techniques. And if you start to walk around in nature, you'll find lots of overhanging trees, or in this particular case, there was in Red Rock Canyon in Nevada, there was a sort of a cave type thing that I was able to get into and then shoot outside, to back to the surrounding area. So I'm inside the cave, sort of shooting back out, as opposed to trying to just stand on the outside and take a shot without any context, any foreground. So these are all sort of different types of frames as we go along. So these are techniques that I'm sure many of you have used either consciously or subconsciously, and you kind of just, oh, this looks cool. But I'm trying to give you a set of considerations that you sometimes might start looking for more deliberately. Leading lines is another very powerful technique, and this is one that I love to use quite a bit. The intention here, again, is to try to guide your viewer's attention. So if there are things in this in the frame that tend to point in certain directions, then you'll get these kinds of leading lines, and they're natural things, like they could be roadways, stairways, fences, so on and so forth. And so there's all kinds of leading lines out there. And so this is a very typical type of situation where your attention's drawn because all the lines sort of point to the model, and you can see that she stood out. You've got your rule of thirds there again, and by the way, the leading line is on a diagonal, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. Here's another set of leading lines where your eye kind of enters the photo, again, a little bit from the left towards the right, and you follow this up to the mountain and sort of the vast expanse of the landscape. So the leading lines were there. I mean, I didn't have to do anything special. Same thing with the fence. You're just taking advantage of them. You're getting nice and low, right? So I was probably, 10, 15 inches from some of these rocks, so that they were dominant in my frame. And this was probably shot with like 24 millimeter lens, so all of the lines in the foreground get exaggerated. Okay. And you're doing portraits, and you say, well, leading lines is got, it's all this landscape stuff. But in fact, if you're doing portraits, you've got sort of the clothing, the placement of the arms, and those types of things that give you leading lines as well. So if somebody's got both elbows down by their side, they're not using their arms in any way to reinforce the face. That's why very often people put their hands on their hip or put their hands towards their head or whatever. It gives you another sort of sense of perspective and draws the viewer's attention a little differently. So leading lines work in all kinds of images, not just the landscapes and the macro and so on and so forth. Contrast. Here what we're doing is we're trying to create something that draws someone's attention. And when we say contrast, we usually think of black and white, light and dark, so on and so forth. But there's many types of contrast out there. There's color contrast, there's texture contrast, there's contrast in terms of big versus small. So we'll talk about some of those types of things later as well. And sort of shape contrast. So you've got, like 5 squares in a circle sort of in your picture. The circle will get a certain amount of attention just because it's different from all the rest. So be aware that contrast is something that can be found or can be created. So here the light is just focusing on the smoke and a little bit of the face. So the emphasis just goes to the brightest part of the image, and that's where your eye tends to go. There's enough detail in the darker portions that your eye isn't lost. Sometimes you can have very, very high contrast, and the only thing you see is the light and the rest has gone black. But here, even though there's detail everywhere, I mean, his lapel, his tie, his hat, I mean, nothing is so black that there's no detail in it, but your eye still jumps to the brightest area. Here you've got color contrasts. I mean, those oranges really pop against the darker browns and the bright skies. And so, and everything else is also sort of soft and smooth and not very sharp, whereas the tiles are really, really crisp and sharp. So you've got color contrast, you've got, a subject isolation in terms of the sharpness there as well. So these types of things sort of, show the pattern, show the repetition, and we'll talk about, some of those techniques as well. But, what you're trying to do is look for color contrast. So if you've got somebody with, a certain style of clothes and the background is a completely different color, then the person stands out. But if the clothes and the background are about the same color, then the face stands out because the face is the thing that's different from all of the others. These are texture contrasts, right? I mean, she is very different from this textured fence. She's also much darker than the fence. So again, there's a color contrast, there's a whatever. The fence again is light. It does command a lot of attention, but in this case, we're getting closer to a high key type of image. And we'll talk about high key versus low key, but there's different techniques that are out there to be able to, again, isolate your subject. And the fence has got a bit of a pattern and some lines to it, which is creating, again, a little bit of a leading line, bringing your eye towards the subject. Here you've got color contrasts, and you've also got texture contrast. The rocks and whatever are bold and have texture. The sky is very soft and so on. So the rocks tend to take a certain amount of prominence, even though there's a lot of sky. We tend to look at the rock and the shadow, the bike. So this was a publicity photo I did for e-bikes Canada, and the whole point was to make sure that the bike got the prominent attention. If somebody were to look at this and says, "Oh, what a great sunset," I probably failed. The bike company wouldn't have been very happy with me. So this is the kind of thing that we're trying to do, and again, you've got sort of got bright colors, which should command attention, but you've got something that's very dark, and so the two of them together tend to create something that is pleasing to the eye. And you've got some nice diagonals again that are in the photograph, and we'll see that diagonals are added for very powerful images. And you've got the spray of light from the sun, which is creating a bit of a very soft leading line again towards your main subject. Okay, symmetry. How are we doing so far? Are you following along?
Yes.
Good. So symmetry is another technique where you're trying to create balance, and this is more of a sort of left, right, up, down type of symmetry, horizontal or vertical axis type of stuff. It can be used using reflections in architecture and in natural elements. So unlike the rule of thirds, this is more splitting your picture in half type of thing. So I mean, reflections are a good place to do that. When you're going to do reflections, get really, really, really low to the water, because that's how you're going to get the best reflection. So here the pictures is got the sort of a top-down type of mirroring type of effect, and it just doubles up on the subject. So it makes it very clear what the subject is, and usually the reflection is less bright, less sharp, less prominent than the main subject. So it becomes also a major minor type theme, and we'll talk again about those types of techniques. But these are all ways to reinforce your subject. So I mean, if you were to take your hand and just hide the bottom portion of any one of these images, it's an okay image. Okay, you just you can see the top half of either one of those images and say, well, it's a couple dancing, that's and some nice horses in the field. But the reflection adds a whole new dimension to the composition, and that's what we're trying to do, is create something that adds a little bit more vibrance, a little bit more impact, and sort of holds your viewer's attention a little bit longer, and makes it clear what the subject really is and what the emphasis of the photo is all about. Mirrors again reinforce whatever's happening in the image. Fitness shots and gyms typically have lots of mirrors, and so that's great for these types of shots. Lets you do the symmetry type thing really cool. On the other hand, they're a pain in the ass, because you've got to spend a lot of time trying to keep yourself out of the mirror, keep your flash out of the mirror, keep all of the other people from the gym out of the mirrors. So it's a lot of work to work with mirrors, but you can get some very nice effects. And patterns and textures. So if you look at the sort of repeating pattern of the weights on the wall and that type of thing.
Mike?
Yeah, go ahead.
You've got a number of people who are asking questions or have their hands up.
Okay.
I don't know whether you noticed or not.
Thanks for telling me. I cannot see that, so I need to go somewhere. Let me see. Just hit your space bar and ask questions, but let me see if I can get that up. No, that's not it. Yeah, I would need somebody to...
It's Carrie that has her hand up.
Okay. Just ask a question, Carrie, or can somebody read the comment? Hand up. Does she know she has her hand up?
Maybe that's the thing.
Oh, I just heard something from Carrie. That's not working for me. Carrie's got an up. A moment ago, she just put a thumbs up in the chat. Carrie, we can't hear you. Can you type something in the chat, maybe? sorry, not helping. Mistake. Okay, good. No problem. All right. Yeah, if somebody can just keep an eye on the chat because it's on another screen and I wouldn't be able to see that. And then just interrupt me as we go along. Okay, so whoops. So these dumbbells are a form of pattern repetition type thing, but I don't want them to be my main subject. So you got to be a little careful sometimes. If you see a strong pattern, it may in fact detract from your subject. So, but there are times when the pattern is in fact your subject.
The question of the photo that was in the lower left.
Yeah.
The primary focus is on which version of the model, the one in the mirror or the one not in the mirror.
So you tell me, right? You know, which one commands your attention?
I look at both, and I can't really tell because your bandwidth is a little, so it's not completely clear.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, so
If I had to say, I'd say the one in the mirror.
yeah, and I would agree with you. And the reason I would agree with you is that's the one that has the viewer's attention. That's the one that's looking at the camera.
Yeah.
And therefore, anything that whenever there's an eye looking towards the camera, that actually tends to command attention too. So what happens is we as people engage with other people, and if someone's watching us, looking right at us, then what ends up happening is we are looking back at them. That's why fashion models very often aren't looking directly at you in a fashion photograph. They're looking off to the side or a little bit to the, looking down or looking at something in their hand or whatever. It's because you don't want to engage the viewer and have them notice the model, her face and her eyes. You want them to look at her clothes and what she's wearing, and that the whole point is glamour. So, is fashion. So that's where, they're very careful in terms of how much they engage the viewer. So I'm just looking to see if everybody was muted here. Okay, we seem to be good. All right. So so in this particular case, I mean, I picked it because of the reflection, but when I look at it more carefully, I tend to go, maybe the one in the mirror is the one that seems to be the dominant one. Ideally, I like to get them as close to the mirror as possible, but the dumbbells kind of just got in the way. But if you want a really strong reflection, get them as close to the reflection as possible. And that way you'll end up with a stronger image. And then you have to make the decision, as was being asked, do you want the reflected image to be looking at the camera? Do you want the main image to be looking towards the camera? Or do you want no eye contact with the image viewer? And so those are the things that will help determine the success of your photo. But this is exactly the type of thing we're talking about is this conveying what it is I wanted to convey? And so you're trying to get that kind of stuff across.
Mary, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so patterns and textures, again, man-made patterns versus natural patterns. There's all kinds out there. If there's a break in the pattern, that becomes a visual resting spot for your eyes, and so that becomes sort of a dominant spot. So, this is one of the complexes, a hotel complex in Aruba, and I just looked up and I just happened to see the sun hitting this building in a certain way. And I took a whole bunch of pictures, and this is one of the ones I like best. But there's some where, the pattern was broken because in the top right, the sky sort of shows up, and there's other places where, there's something on a railing or whatever. So, you play with it to come up with the pattern that you want. A close-up of some frost on a window. And again, there's a whole bunch of pattern happening, but there's one kind of off to the side, in the rule of thirds there, and so it stands out from all of the others and tends to dominate your focus. So your eye travels through the picture and sees a whole bunch of patterns, and then all of a sudden it lands on a spot which typically is a little different from all the others, and that's just the way our brains work. So you use that to advantage to create the right kind of composition. The rule of odds, again, the way our brain works, if you've got an even number of things, your brain tends to divide them, top, bottom, left, right, etc. Odd number creates a sense of balance and harmony that your brain just doesn't divide things quite the same way. So if you have 3 flowers in a frame, your eye will move around them, focus on each of them, maybe land on one of them as a bit of a subject. But if you have 4 flowers in your frame, then you tend to pair them up into groups of some sort. And so, if you can have odds of things, 3 birds, 3 flowers, 3 whatever, then there's an advantage. So the rule of odds is not a strict rule. It's something that you just become aware of. So if you do have a chance to decide whether you're going to frame 2 flowers or 4 flowers or whatever, that's great. And the rule of odds is also works best with a low number. I mean, you don't try to have like 99 something in a picture. That just becomes a pattern, and the rule of odds is really not working. So
just a very quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
So I've been sort of experimenting with still life.
Yeah.
So in a still life picture with Rembrandt lighting, and I'm glad you talked about that left to right thing.
Yeah.
So would that rule of odds play into something like a still life? Like if I put too many props into my still life, is that a good thing, a bad thing? Should I keep it simple with just like 3 props?
So still life is great for this kind of stuff because you are in control not just of the exposure and all the things that the camera can control, but you're creating the art as well. So you have to have 2 sets of skills for still life. People who do food photography and that kind of stuff, my gosh, those people are so patient. They'll arrange every little sort of bean of coffee bean on a plate just right, and do I turn the bean left or right? So a lot of work goes into preparing something. Anyways, so back to your still life. If you were to have, let's say, a little bowl with 3 oranges versus 4 oranges, I think you'll probably be more successful with 3 than 4 because of some of the rules that we're just talking about. You experiment, see what works for you. But the other thing you can do is put 3 oranges together and then one a little bit off to the side, so that it's it dominates your frame. You've got sort of a cluster and then something that stands on its own, and that becomes your visual resting point. So you can experiment, but typically an odd number will hold someone's attention a little bit better.
Thank you. Because when I've been to museums and look at some of the old masters still life, it's chock full of stuff.
That's a good place to study. It's a very good place to study, is to look at some of the old masters and see what they've done, and they had free reign, right? They've got a brush and a canvas, and they could paint 4, 5, 6, whatever, and you'll often find things in clusters of 3.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so 3 flowers works fine, but it could also be clusters of things, right? 3, whatever those flowers are over there on the right, and it can be 3 stems of things. If they're slightly different sizes, that helps because then you've got a little bit of a pattern going on as well. And if they can be arranged in a bit of a diagonal or something, that's great. And if one of them can take a more prominent position, then now all of a sudden you've got sort of something that really grabs someone's attention because one of them is more prominent than the others. So these are all, again, factors in the still life world. That's another whole discussion. Is the entire thing from the very front of my frame all the way to the far back all in pure sharp, or is it going to be sort of a very low depth of field? So when I'm laying out a platter of flowers or a platter of cold cuts or whatever it is I'm shooting, should something in the center of the plate be really sharp and everything else just supports it, or is everything got to be sharp from beginning to end? I guess some of that might depend on whether you're doing a piece of art and you're trying to get a certain mood across, or whether you're trying to do something commercially, in which case, typically if you get a poster of a burger or a sandwich or whatever for a restaurant, it's sharp from front to end because they want you to see the product and not just assume whatever about the product and its textures and so on. So if you don't have 3 of something, Major minor themes, another one that I like to play with because not everything in the world ends up in three. So you end up with sort of a major item and then something that echoes its shape or echoes its color in the background, or is kind of those sort of a little sidekick, type of scenario. So that tends to create a bit of harmony and balance. And so, here you've got a flower that, stands out, and then it's not just a solo flower. And it's hard to visualize, but if that flower was by itself and everything in the background was green, and you could certainly do that with Photoshop very easily, and it would just be a standalone solo flower. Not bad. It's in the rule of thirds and all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of leading lines pointing you to the center portion of the seed pod of the flower. But having another flower in the background just gives it something that your eye can bounce back and forth between. So it's a nice one. Would it have been a stronger picture if there had been a third flower in the background somewhere? Maybe, but we're just playing with techniques, and sometimes in nature and as a photographer, you have to do the best you can with whatever you got in front of you. And if you gotta try different angles and different ways, and you still can't quite get three, then work with two. But be aware of some of the techniques so that you can make the best of the situation, and that's kind of what we try to do. This was commented on. This was something I took at Mud Lake some time ago, and everyone comments on the fact that the shadow is there, and the shadow makes the picture a whole lot different than if it was just a close-up of the bird. So I ended up cheating a little bit because the sun was awfully high, and that shadow was in fact probably about 3 or 4 inches further down on your screen. So I ended up kind of rearranging a few elements, but I knew I wanted to take the picture, and I wanted the shadow to be in close proximity to the woodpecker and not have a picture that was very, very tall. This would have been a very tall, very narrow photo to try to get the original shadow in place. So, I knew what I wanted, and I made it happen, but in this particular case, I couldn't get it, quote, right in camera, other than it was right for my next step. And my next step was to converge the shadow and the original subject.
So the very tall and narrow. So typically I'm getting, you don't use 16:9 as a format for cropping.
16:9, I would only use it as a horizontal for
Landscape?
For landscape, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, see, that's we talked earlier. What are you going to do with this thing? If you're going to be showing pictures on a television type of thing, then that's great. And a vertical on a television doesn't do very well because you've got 80% of the screen is blank. Right, so portrait type images don't do well on your typical sort of widescreen TV. So if you're going to bring up portraits on a widescreen TV, you might do something like put 2 at a time up or something like that, just to fill the screen. Or if you're doing a slideshow, you bring up a portrait image and let it glide across the screen or something like that. You want to fill up you want to fill up the screen and not have people squinting at it. So how much of the space do you fill? And this whole business of negative space comes into play. And it's not one that I use a lot of. It's one I'm aware of, and it's very interesting. What it does is isolates your subject. And so you can have sort of something which is very stable, harmonious, but the weight is all on one portion of the image, and the rest of it's pretty empty. So you can have the negative space on both sides of your subject, top and bottom. It could be asymmetrical. You can put it in a couple of different ways. But the thing is, the empty, uninteresting area is what offsets or frames the main subject. So by having this performer, sort of in this overall space, she looks like she's up on a stage. She looks like she's high up because there's nothing underneath her, etc. If I zoomed in and all you saw was the bottom of the frame was close to her toes and the other end of the frame was close to her hand, she doesn't have the same sort of feeling or mood. So the negative space there, I think, helps give you a sense of grandeur in terms of what she's doing. Here we were in Peru and Sacsai woman area, and the photographer was taking pictures of these blocks. So what hits you is the shadow, and it's obviously somebody taking a picture and so on, and the negative space actually tells you what they're taking a picture of. What's cute is it also gives you a sense of perspective in this particular case. The shadow is smaller than these rocks, and in fact these rocks, each one of these are 6 to 8 feet in height, and they're hundreds of tons. So how they got them shaped like that and moved in there is a whole fascinating story. But rather than taking a picture, standing back and taking a picture of the rocks and so on and so forth, here it's just I'm using the shadow as my subject, showing somebody doing something, again that storytelling thing. But at the same time, the negative space in this case carries a little bit of a message, which isn't always the case. In many cases, the negative space it conveys habitat for nature photographs. So you can see a little bit of where this creature lives, and that's sort of the background. Is it water? Is it air? Is it whatever? Blank sky with a bird flying is a good example of negative space, that type of thing. So those are basic rules that we talked about. Then there's a whole bunch of other considerations, and some of them I was mentioning as we went along. The whole concept of strong diagonals, of a visual resting point, so that your picture's not too cluttered, your eye tracking left to right, where we look with our eyes in terms of tracking other people's eyes, looking for the lightest elements, telling stories, etc. So we'll talk about some of these as we go along, and you'll see some of these previous concepts reinforced as well. So strong diagonals tend to make a picture look a lot more dramatic, more dynamic. If you have something that's straight up and down, it looks static, sort of the tin soldier type of thing, standing at attention, etc. You start to put some dynamic elements into your picture by adding some diagonals, and you'll usually improve your composition. So those are things to pay attention to. A leaf coming over from the side, the rays of light coming down, all of those are some good diagonals, and they tend to just bring your eye up, and then you start to see the tree, and then the branch kind of falls down. So I mean your eye kind of comes in here, sees this bright, whoops, I went too far. Your eye comes in here, goes along the bottom, follows these rays up, and maybe follows this back down, and your eye kind of just follows into this thing. So you want to kind of think about how your eye is going to track through an image. So diagonals tend to flow your eye from one place to another, whereas a static line, your eye sometimes will stop, will hop over it, type of thing. It's like a dividing line as opposed to something you follow. A visual resting point. There are pictures that are interesting, but they have no particular subject that you're looking at. So here you can decide for yourself: is the subject the snowman, or is the subject the eye, the whatever those eyelashes, whatever. Depends on what you're looking at. But if I look at sort of a quote landscape, I don't know what I'm looking at. Is it the texture of the snow? Is it the trees? Is it, I don't consider this a really successful photo. I mean, it was a nice day, the beautiful sunshine. It was warm. I was enjoying my walk, but stop, take a picture, and I went, when you look at it afterwards, you're going, it doesn't say anything to me. So different photo, a lot of negative space here. Your eye walks in, follows the blank areas, maybe hits these trees. There's a diagonal line going from your diagonal line will go from the top down here, and it leads you over to here. In this rule of thirds, you've got this clump of trees that kind of holds your attention, and then maybe the dark lines will follow your eyes back down to the tree, and so your eyes are just kind of flowing around in here. There's nothing up here that just takes your attention away. Maybe a sensor spot or whatever, maybe up there, but your eye just flows into this picture and then comes all the way around and back again. So you've got a resting spot, and it's kind of this general area over here. Okay, so the whole question of left to right, right to left again. So again, I mean, I look at this photograph, and butterflies in the rule of thirds, that's fine. There's some nice diagonal lines, that's fine. But to me, the diagonal lines are leading my eye back out of the photo. So it comes in, I see the butterfly, and then it kind of like I follow these lines and then I end up over here somewhere, and I kind of, why am I looking there? If I switch it around, I just find that all of a sudden these leading lines just bring me to the butterfly, and this is almost like a stop line type of thing. My eyes kind of just stop here and come back to the butterfly, and my eye ends up staying in this portion of the image, as opposed to, I find over here I see the butterfly and then my eye tends to flow away from the butterfly, and so I'm trying to look at those types of things. I think I made another change here. Here's another little thing that I pay attention to: distractions. This little bright dot right near the edge of a photograph, that bugs me. Just that bottom left there, that little dot is the type of thing that I take the photograph, I look at it, it's great, and I want to make some changes, and the things that I did is I ended up cropping that dot out of there, and I ended up reversing it, and I think I got rid of that little distraction over here as well. Yeah, I got rid of that little distraction. So I pay attention to a lot of the things. Anything that's bright, sharp, near the edge of a photograph is another thing I look for in terms of distractions. And it's not really part of your composition in that it's there or it's not there because in the photograph, but when I get to post-processing, then eliminating distractions is something I spend a lot of time on, and that might be another session we do at some point in time, is looking for and removing distractions. The whole concept of cropping, cloning, healing, to strengthen your image. Eye travel. When you have someone in a photograph and they're looking somewhere, one of the things we do is we tend to look at what they're looking at. So her looking at her stomach brings more attention and more focus to her stomach. If this was a glamour shot and she was looking right at us, then you would tend to see her and her eyes and her face with more prominence, and the belly would take second fiddle type of thing. So it's interesting to see that. Now, if you have a commercial shot and somebody is holding a pendant in their hand or doing something, your eye will go to what they're looking at, and it'll have, again, more prominence in the image. The lightest part of the image is typically what people will look at. So if there were some bright sunflowers in the background over here that happen to be, hit by a ray of sunlight or something like that, they would be very distracting and take attention away from the main subject here. So certainly you've got the bright, the sunflower that's getting a lot of attention. You've got vertical lines or diagonal lines kind of just pointing you to that particular sunflower. Had I moved a little bit to the left or a little bit right, you probably would have this V of the sky land over here somewhere. So, this is where, a little bit of positioning and trying to get your picture in just the right place. By paying attention to all the elements behind you, you've got something that points in the right place. And sort of the pattern in the background gives you a little bit of ambiance. That's kind of negative space. I didn't make it black, right? Could have certainly easily made all of this black in the background, but there's just enough there to say there's a lot more of these. So it's not a lone sunflower that could have been shot in a studio or whatever. So these are all sort of the things to look at. Here's a duck on the water, everything's nice. To me, the brightest part is his feathers. So that's really what gets all my attention. If I brighten up the head a little bit, and you just see a little, I don't know if you can see the difference. Somebody said the bandwidth was low last time, but I just brightened the head a little bit and brought the head a little bit more into the proximity of the brightness of the feathers. I didn't reduce the brightness of the feathers, but I just brightened the head. And what I'm trying to do is put more attention on the eyes, the beak, the head, and so that it's not just the body that gets my attention. So it's just a little bit of post-processing in this case, because I know that I want the brightest part. Another technique that we sometimes use is vignetting. Why do you vignette? Well, because you darken the edges so that all your attention goes to the center of the image, and the bird gets a little bit brighter. I don't think I did any vignetting on this one, but it's an example of why we do something like vignetting, and it's to draw your attention to the center of the image, which happens to be the brightest. With a low-key image, it's pretty obvious that the bright part will catch your attention. So I mean, everything else that goes into darkness kind of just gives it a little bit of mood, a little bit of flavor. But certainly her face draws a lot of the attention in this particular case. If the picture is completely white and you've got a high key image, your eyes do the reverse. I mean, there's just so much white here, and there's no detail anywhere in the white that it doesn't command your attention anymore. And so the contrast is what takes over in this particular case. So this doesn't become a matter of, it's the white that dominates your attention. It's the contrast that dominates your attention. So your image, your eyes just go to her eyes and her lips and her earring. And you've got a set of three there, right? Sort of the dark eyes, the earring, the lips, that kind of forms a bit of a triangle. And we haven't talked about triangles, but along with diagonals, things that are triangular tend to command a lot of attention as well. So if you look at her elbows from here to there, and you've got a bit of a triangle going on with her face. And I didn't mention triangles in some of the others, but I probably should have. But there's a lot of places where there are triangles that are built in. Same thing when you're posing somebody. The hands on the hip means the arm is forming a triangle against the body, and the other hand up against the head. There's another triangle that's being formed that way. So it's when you're posing people, having them just stand erect at soldier attention is pretty boring. You want to create a number of triangles and strengthen your composition that way. Telling a story is a good way to convey something. If your picture has something that lets people ask questions, like what's he reaching for back there? Does he see her? Does he know the guns in her hand? Guns in her hand. You've got something going on. The piece that's sharp draws your attention, and then the rest of it becomes almost sort of the ambiance, the question of what's going on in the image. So telling a story kind of is a good way to involve your viewer. They'll spend a little bit more time looking at your photo, asking themselves the question, what is the story here? What's going on? So that's something you want to do. Again, the eyes are looking at the map. You tend to look at the map, and then you start to ask yourself, what are they looking for? Did they just get off the train? Are they looking for something? Are they lost? Looking for a fun nightclub? I don't know, right? So you use these elements to take advantage of that. In this particular case, there's a line cutting through their head, the white line of the train. That's an example of a leading line that I don't like, because it's not leading you to anything useful. So, I mean, if I could have gotten a little higher, I probably would have, and just not had that cutting through the back of their head. Where there's a lot of rules about whether the line of the horizon, if you're shooting somebody on a beach, should cut through someone's head or not, and that type of thing. And I try to avoid that. I try to make the horizon line above their head, or around their body, so that the body is what brings you attention, as opposed to the horizon line. But that's another one of the things. We can keep talking about all kinds of rules and triangles and horizon lines. The number of things I could have included here just never seem to end. But I didn't want this presentation to last 5 hours. Okay, perspective. Perspective is something we can often change, and in the previous example I said I wish I could have gotten a little higher, so I don't always bring a stool with me to shoots, but sometimes I do. So the fun little shot of the sort of the Candyland shot type of thing is something we did in studio. And so I mean, it's very easy to shoot from a high perspective. She's down on the ground and that's great. For the dress type of thing, we wanted to show the beautiful design of that particular gown. It's something I did for a designer, and we wanted to show that the dress standing up looked very nice, but on the ground it had this very unique pattern of this circular pattern. So got up on a stool and shot down and made sure that her head was contained within the circle. Had I been a little lower, then the top of her head here may have intersected that circle, and so that this line in the back of her head would have been broken, and I don't want that. So I wanted to keep her head within the overall circle. So that's kind of make sure that your eye can travel around the dress and see the circular pattern. So this is, the type of thing that you look for. When you're doing portraits, very often if you turn the nose too far over, the nose will break the cheek line, just like her head would have broken the edge of the hemline. So, this is the type of thing that you're trying to do to avoid, sort of poor composition or poor symmetry. Low angles. Oh, by the way, the nice thing about high angles is the couch and everything else in that room disappear, right? It's just the floor. So the floor, if sometimes you see a nice pattern on the floor or a nice texture on the floor, then make your floor the background. Here, the sky's the background. Okay, if you take a look at this vehicle on the left, there's buildings in the background, there were people standing in the background, there were many other cars at this car show that would have all been in the background, and the low angle just got rid of all of that clutter. And so here we're looking at a fun perspective of this motorbike type thing, or I don't know what the right term is. It's not quite a motorbike, but the low perspective essentially got rid of a whole bunch of distractions that were back there. I mean, I couldn't have done anything about the parasol, but it was just there. But at least it doesn't seem to dominate the photo. Same type of thing over here. There's fencing, there's barns, there's other horses, and so on and so forth. So this made the sky the image. She's looking up at the horse, which obviously ends up making the horse the more dominant subject rather than her. And also it's one of those vertical type shots as opposed to horizontal, so it's got a little bit more dynamic sort of appeal to it, making the horse look a lot more sort of strong and powerful and so on. Okay, another low angle, so that's kind of neat. But another thing I try to do is, especially for landscapes and so on, is 3 planes of focus, right? So there's a foreground that sort of lays the groundwork for where are you type of thing. There's a middle ground, in this case happens to be our subject, and then there's a background that just provides some overall context. So having 3 planes provides depth to your image, and if you can include all 3, that's great. Very often what we do is we take pictures at what somebody described as bullseye vision, right? You take the picture, at a height of 5'10" or whatever your height is. You take the picture horizontally and you put the subject right smack in the center. And so, that kind of bullseye vision makes for, images that aren't necessarily very compelling. If you try to shoot low, you try to shoot high, you'll be able to include other things, and other things become more prominent. So these leaves in the foreground take on a whole bunch more prominence than if the picture had been shot, at eye level. And then you see the leaves on the ground, but they certainly don't dominate the photo. So these are the types of things that you want to take a look at. So let's add some of these things up and put them together. So let's open up some discussions here. Where are the diagonals in this image?
That ribbony thing around her.
Yeah,
head
for sure. Yeah, if you take that off, is it the same photo?
Much less interesting.
Yeah, it adds an element of interest. So you've also got leading lines, and just look at her clothing in terms of, like you've almost got like a little arrow in terms of her clothing, in terms of it just lands, points up. Her arm position is also giving a little bit of leading line. I would have brought her shoulder down a little bit if I noticed it when I took the photo. Something I can change in Photoshop, but I didn't. Rule of thirds.
Is that her? Would that be her left eye?
Yeah, it would be her right eye actually. This one right here is more in the rule of thirds. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
for
here's
some reason I'm drawn to her right eye.
yeah, and I think it's proximity to the other thing. But anyways, yeah, but the whole thing. The other thing is in portraits. We mentioned rule of thirds. You can have the 1, 2, 3, 4 points, But you can also look at rule of thirds as a line coming down here, and you put things on this line, or you put things on this line, or you put things on that line. You can put things on the line, not just in those intersection points. So here, her body is on this line, and her eyes are on that top line. And that's typically where you want the eyes in a portrait type thing. It's at the 1/3 mark. When you're doing landscapes and you're doing the rule of thirds, you typically want something like the horizon line either at the top line or the horizon line at the bottom line. You usually don't put the horizon in the middle unless you're doing the reflection type thing, right? Where the top and bottom are evenly divided into reflections. So, and then if you've got the leading lines again, in terms of the arms and the dress, and subject separation. I mean, there's really no background here to distract from the subject, right? So it just makes for it's very clear where the subject is, and we didn't put anything out of focus, so it's not just the eyes that are the key thing. It's the overall model that becomes the subject, and not just her eyes, unlike the ones that we had earlier where the model was just such a shallow depth of field that the eyes were sharp, and then the earrings and the dress and everything else went away.
I might
Yes, sir.
have a question.
Go.
Okay, the last picture seems to be, you see the backlighting, okay, the halo around her also accentuated herself too, right?
That's probably
The
true.
light.
Yeah. There's a little bit of light around her body and stuff. I'm not sure where that came from. That might have been some lighting on the background. I may have also done some vignetting along the edge, along the back end. I don't recall. This was years ago.
Uh-huh.
But you're right. There's a bit of a halo around her that adds to that separation between her and the background. Yeah. So a lot of things happening here. Right. So you've got sort of the shadow acting sort of as a major minor type theme. You've got contrast between her being colored and the shadow being monochrome. You've got some separation from the background in terms of the simplicity. I mean, not that I went out of my way to make sure the background was soft or whatever, but the separation comes from terms of there's not a lot of detail in the background. It's very uniform, where she breaks up that pattern. That pattern that's going through the background is one thing, and everything else doesn't have that diagonal wooden pattern, so it stands out as a result. Lots of negative space. So when you've got negative space and people moving, one of the things we didn't talk about is if you've got somebody moving quickly on a bike or something like that, or you've got a bird flying through the air, etc. You want to have room for the subject to move. So the negative space that's down here lets her kind of roll into it, type of thing. And you want the same type of thing if you've got a bird that's kind of flying. You don't want the bird right here about to fly out of the frame. You want the bird kind of right over here with lots of room to travel into the frame. If you have a dog that's running, you want the dog kind of right down here running up into the frame, as opposed to you've got this blank space all the way up and then a dog right at the back at the top end about to jump out of the frame. So give your subjects room to move. Boats, cars, dogs, birds, anything that's moving or has motion, let it go move into the frame. So there's almost an implied leading line in terms of their intended direction. A bit of a storytelling thing going on here. She's practicing. She's getting ready for something. As I look at the photo, I see some of the materials creating an interesting little shadow kind of right down here that I find distracting. I might have gone back and cleaned that up a little bit, but that's the kind of level of detail that I like to go through, is make sure that I'm looking at every element of the photo to decide is this help? Does this tell part of the story, or is it kind of distract visually, etc.? And the high angle is an interesting perspective. This was at the marina in Aylmer, if I remember right. So I was up on a bridge or a platform, and she was performing down below, and I was able to take some other interesting images. I did some others where I was really, really low and the sky's the background, but this one helped tell a little bit of the story and that type of thing. Anyways, so hey, we did good on time. So we got room for questions if people want. And we have a session coming up in a little while on critiques. So this is a great opportunity for you guys to join the critique session and have some photos sort of brought forward where we can talk a little bit about, is this the right thing? What else could I have done different? That type of thing. So the photo critique thing is coming up. When is this? Photo critique is coming up on the 29th of Wednesday. So I got a couple of people. How many people are RSVP'd here? Let's refresh. Okay, so Danielle, Debbie, a couple of people already RSVP'd. So I just released this morning. So the goal is to submit a couple of pictures, number them 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And what we'll do is we'll do all the ones, then all the twos, then all the threes. When we're out of time, we run out of time. So depending on how many photos we get, we may go through all of them, or we may go through just a subset. But I try to get through all the ones and all the twos type of thing. And so get your most important images done first. So that way, if you really, really want feedback on a particular image, make sure it's your number 1 or your number 2 images, because we may not get to all of them. Very often we get so many pictures that we can't get through all of them, but this is a great way to learn. And you can join us even if you haven't submitted any images. You just see what everyone else has done and get some inspiration, get some feedback. And sometimes, depending on how many I have, I may not just critique them, but I may go into Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever and say, look what happens if we brighten this spot, or if we darken this area, and look what happens if we crop this little distraction out of the edge. And so we can sometimes show technique, and it's not meant to be a Lightroom or Photoshop course, but you'll see sort of an examples of how we can very, very quickly, we take literally less than half a minute to a minute to work on some of these images and just punch up the contrast or change some of the distractions, or crop it a little bit differently. So, and all right, anything in the chat that I missed? Nothing there. And there we go. All right. I'm just checking to see if there's anything in the chat there.
So someone picked up their hand, wanted to talk.
That was me. I hit the wrong button.
No problem. Very good. All right. So, any questions before we sign off?
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
I do a lot of landscape nature stuff.
Yeah.
I'm a dilettante. I try to experiment with all kinds of stuff, but I find it really hard when I'm doing landscape or nature photography. In terms of composition, because I tend to need to work quite quickly. If I'm doing bird photography or something, and I don't have a long lens, so I use a, I don't know, 55 to 300. Mm-hmm. Should I take a more wide angle approach and then just in post crop it to something interesting, or should I be taking more time to?
So you're definitely limited by what you can do in post, and I'm a real strong believer in get it right in camera. But here's for instance, if you're doing a nice wide angle shot of a landscape, and you're getting down nice and low, and you've got this lake in front of you. Well, if you get nice and low, and what's in front of you is some foreground, and it might be a couple of wildflowers or something like that in the foreground with the lake. If you just move a little bit to the left, all of a sudden you don't have the white wildflowers in the foreground. You've got maybe a nice textured rock. You can't do that in post, and you can't do that with cropping. I mean, cropping can only get you so far. You can do so much more by taking a few extra moments and take a shot lower down, take a shot a little higher up, take a shot a little bit to the left, take a shot a little bit to the right. Look for different things to put into your foreground. You can also choose to take a picture that's mostly the lake and a little bit of foreground, so you have a slice of foreground in the bottom of your photo. You've got a beautiful lake in the center, and you've got just a sliver of sky. If all of a sudden you change your composition to something a little bit lower down, then the lake is almost level with your camera. You would have a sliver of lake, because the lake is now, you're not looking down on it, it's not filling up your frame, you just got a sliver of lake, and now the sky becomes the main element, and you've got lots of beautiful clouds, and you've got a little bit of lake, and you've got a little bit of foreground with the rock or the flowers or whatever you chose to put there. So clearly cropping is not going to give you a lot of advantage compared to what you could do while you're on the scene. So think of it this way, give yourself 3 or 4 different perspectives of the same subject while you're there, and you'll find all of a sudden when you get back you've got a lot more to work with. As for the lens, etc., if you're trying to do a close-up of a bird and you don't have a long lens, then you're just making up for the fact that you don't have a 200 millimeter lens. If you take a really nice, sharp, steady photo of the bird with a 50 millimeter lens and you zoom in and crop it, so now you got a nice crisp bird, that's fine, nothing wrong with that. I mean, you've just taken advantage of the fact that instead of having a 10 years ago you might have invested in a 200 millimeter lens or a 500 millimeter lens and had a 5 megapixel camera. Nowadays you got a 50 megapixel camera, so you can afford to do a lot of cropping and still get a really nice crisp image. So nothing wrong with cropping to make sure to take advantage of the fact that you don't have a long lens. But other than that, if you're doing landscape, position, foreground, deciding what to include or not to include, tilt of your camera, how much sky to include versus how much of the ground to include, those are all key. If you're just doing a bird, then getting as close and as tight as possible makes for a great composition. A little bird in your image, way off in the distance, and someone says, "What is this?" And you say, "Oh, look over there, it's a woodpecker. Can't you see it?" Clearly that you were not successful in conveying to your viewer what your subject was.
Thank you.
No problem. We're good? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for presenting.
No problem. Well, enjoy your weekend, folks. I'm glad people were able to join me. Hopefully this was beneficial, and I will put a copy of the slides and material up on the Meetup site. So if you want to refer back to these types of things, the PDF will be there with all of that material.
Thank you very much. Very
No problem.
informative.
All right. Have a good weekend, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Anytime.